Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little softer. A time of silk robes, incense smoke, and mountain mist. We're diving into what it truly meant to send a letter during the Heian period of Japan, a world where paper was more precious than pearls, and a single message might take weeks to cross the islands. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. You're in Kyoto, but not the Kyoto you know now. No blinking neon signs or late-night ramen stalls. The year is somewhere between 900 and 1000 AD. The Heian era is in full swing. The capital, known as Heian-kyu, is the center of aristocratic culture, poetry, and politics. It is not yet a bustling city of commoners, but a refined and tightly controlled world of courtiers, officials, and bureaucracy. And if you wanted to send a message, you couldn't just scribble something down and toss it into a postbox. No, writing a letter was an event, an art form, sometimes even a political gamble. The person writing might have been an official at court, surrounded by bamboo blinds and lacquered screens. Or it might have been a noblewoman, like the famed Murasaki Shikibu, composing a letter on thin, delicate sheets of mulberry paper, dyed in soft blues or yellows, sometimes dusted with mica flakes so it shimmered under candlelight. Ink wasn't just black. It was ground from ink sticks and mixed with water on stone slabs, prepared carefully, its thickness adjusted for mood or formality. The brush had to glide gently, each stroke curved with elegance. Sloppy handwriting could be an insult. Certain poetic phrases had to be chosen carefully, especially if the letter was to someone of higher rank. Imagine this. You're kneeling on tatami mats in a quiet room. You've lit a stick of incense. You're grinding ink slowly, rhythmically. You smooth the paper with your palm and begin writing right to left in flowing Kona script. You don't just say, "Hello, I hope you're well." You might say something like, "The moonlight last night felt like your presence on my sleeve." Every word, every pause between lines speaks volumes. Now that the letter is written, it must be folded. Folding also had its own code. A letter of love might be folded once, sealed with perfume and tied with a string of specific color. An official document might be folded 3 times and marked with a wax seal or stamped with a cinnabar red vermilion seal. Personal letters were sometimes wrapped in layers of silk cloth, and here's where it gets difficult getting it to someone. You couldn't just hand it off to a reliable postal service. There was no such thing. In Heian Japan, letter delivery was an intensely human operation. If you were lucky, very lucky, you had access to the imperial courier system, a loose network of horseback riders, runners, and boatmen who could carry messages from province to province. These were called the Akishi, and they were stationed at Umayyad government-established way stations, roughly every 16 kilometers along certain roads. These way stations kept horses and local staff, and in theory, a letter could pass from one to the next like a baton. But in practice, it was a mess. Corruption, delays, even weather could halt everything. And if your letter was personal, not a matter of state, it might never be allowed on the official routes at all. More commonly, people relied on servants, or monks, or traveling merchants, sometimes even wandering actors. Whoever was headed in the right direction, really. These travelers weren't always literate, and they couldn't always be trusted. Letters might be lost, misread, stolen, or just forgotten. The average letter, even from Kyoto to Nara, a journey of just 35 kilometers, might take days, weeks, if you were unlucky. and sometimes the person receiving it wouldn't respond at all. It's strange to imagine in our world of instant messages and read receipts, but back then, silence didn't always mean rudeness. Sometimes, a nobleman might deliberately wait a few days before replying to a romantic note, just to seem aloof. Other times, a reply might be lost in the hills, or simply never written because the sender had fallen out of favor. The waiting was part of the process. The uncertainty, the patience, the ritual of wondering. Now picture this scene. It's dawn. A courier, just a humble servant boy really, is preparing to leave the city. He tucks a letter into his sleeve. Maybe he's carrying several, each folded differently, marked with different family crests. He slips on straw sandals, adjusts his sash, and steps out into the grey morning. Mist clings to the ground. The streets are muddy, empty but for the distant bark of a dog and the soft clop of hooves echoing from a shrine road. He walks. Sometimes he catches a ride in an ox cart. Other times he hitches a boat ride down the river. He stops at a roadside. Inn, pays with a rice token, and sleeps on a wooden board. Days pass like this. Forests, rain, sun. The occasional bandit threat. Sometimes he delivers the letter. Sometimes he gives it to someone else, with instructions and a polite bow. And meanwhile, the recipient of the letter, perhaps a lady at a country estate, waits. She might be reclining on a veranda, gazing into her garden, brushing her hair, and thinking of the letter that may or may not arrive. Her inkstone is ready. A clean sheet of paper rests nearby. She too is waiting for the moment to respond, to fold her words into quiet lines and send them floating back across the landscape. So many letters never made it. So many emotions carried on paper that disappeared in rivers, or were opened by the wrong hands, or simply faded into dust inside someone's sleeve. Yet the letters kept being written, because even when the delivery was unreliable, the message still mattered. It makes you wonder, was the letter ever really about the destination? Or was it about the ritual, the act of writing, of caring enough to try? By now, our courier has left the borders of the capital. The bamboo fences of Kyoto are far behind him. What lies ahead are the foothills of Honshu, winding paths through cedar groves, narrow bridges over cold streams, and villages so small they might not even have names. The air is different out here, quieter, earthier, the soft murmur of city. Court life fades, replaced by crows in the trees, the rustle of wind in dry grasses, and the occasional clatter of his traveling pack. He pauses to check the letter, still sealed, still folded tight with string, and presses it gently inside. His sash. The cloth of his robes is damp from dew, but he doesn't stop to rest just yet. Because in the Heian world, time doesn't move quickly, but it does move steadily. And for a letter to arrive late, especially one sent by an official or a noble, could mean more than just embarrassment. It could mean missed ceremonies, strained alliances, or insult where there was only intention. Let's step back for a moment. Because what's often forgotten in stories of elegance and poetry from Heian Japan is that all of it, all the rituals, letters, and court dances had to travel. The court itself relied on news. Orders had to be sent. Land disputes needed settling. Promotions, inheritances, temple decrees. These all had to move across a network that barely held together, thread by thread. This was especially true in provinces farther from the capital. The empire stretched along the islands, but real control faded with distance. Out there in places like Dazafu, in Kyushu, or the northern provinces near Mutsu. Imperial reach was more theoretical than practical. Messages sent to these places often had to cross rivers without bridges, climb slopes where only deer had carved paths, and pass through lands held by local warrior clans who answered only loosely to the throne. To help with this, Heian Japan relied on a system called the Shuen, privately held estates owned by aristocrats, religious institutions, or retired emperors. These estates functioned like little pockets of power, and each one developed its own way of communicating with the capital. That might mean stationing their own messengers, maintaining a handful of horses, or even paying local guides to act as escorts. In some areas, messages had to be hidden, disguised inside bamboo flutes, or tucked into the lining of travel garments, especially when moving through contested regions. Letters between monasteries, for example, often carried sensitive information about landholdings, donations, or disputes. And because Buddhist monasteries were powerful landowners in the Heian period, those letters could influence politics at the highest levels. Sometimes a single lost scroll could spark years of litigation, and litigation, in those days, was handled by writing even more letters. There's something beautifully strange about it all. The farther from the center one traveled, the more fragile and yet more important written words became. In the capital, a letter might be a flirtation. In the provinces, it might be the only link to power. Let's take a quiet detour here, into the world of Onmyuji, the imperial diviners. These were officials trained in a mix of astronomy, Taoism, and native Shinto practices. Before certain messages could even be sent, these diviners might be consulted to choose an auspicious day. Some letters were withheld for days, not because the writer had second thoughts, but because the stars hadn't aligned. In fact, there were entire scrolls of calendrical taboos that dictated what kind of business could be conducted on any given day. And so, even before a courier stepped outside, he might have had to wait. Not because the road was blocked, but because the diviner said it was unwise to begin a journey when the northern star was inauspicious, or when the moon was too thin, or when certain directions were closed to travel. When he finally did depart, he would have followed old imperial roads, not wide and paved like Roman highways, but modest dirt paths, winding through the countryside. These were known as the Gokishichdej, the 5 provinces and 7 circuits, which outlined administrative regions and major routes. Most of these roads had long since fallen into disrepair, but the names remained. A courier might say, "I'm traveling east along the Takeda," even if that meant slipping down a narrow trail, stepping carefully over exposed tree roots, and hoping not to lose a sandal in the mud dot along the way. He'd meet others. Tea merchants, pilgrims, traveling priests, retired warriors, maybe a woman leading a pack horse, maybe another messenger coming the other way. And if he had time or inclination, he might stop and share stories, or not, because the truth is, many of these couriers were quiet by necessity. The less they spoke, the fewer questions they answered. The more invisible they were, the more likely the message would arrive intact. Meanwhile, back at court, life went on in sliding screens and whispered gossip. It was a world obsessed with appearance, but deeply vulnerable to what lay beyond its walls. A single delayed message might cause embarrassment at a poetry gathering. A missing missive might throw off a political maneuver. Sometimes, whole appointments were made based on letters received too late, and then retracted once the original message finally arrived weeks later. That slowness shaped everything. Think about that. A world where timing was flexible, where slowness was expected, but where communication still held enormous weight. Messages weren't just for information, they were symbols, evidence, proof that one had been remembered, or noticed, or invited, or excluded. Some couriers carried tiny charms to keep them safe. A scrap of cloth blessed by a temple, or a talisman inked with sacred script. Some carried nothing at all, and some never returned. Their names lost, their letters never delivered, their footsteps long since swallowed by grass and fog, and yet the system kept going. Somehow it makes you wonder, how many conversations never truly happened? How many replies arrived too late to matter? The letter has finally arrived. The courier, barefoot now, with the soles of his sandals worn smooth, stands before a small gate. Beyond it lies a provincial estate, a quiet pond, a tilt of thatched roofing, a sliding screen open to the garden. A woman waits just inside, not the recipient necessarily, perhaps a servant, or the steward of the estate. The courier bows, kneels, and presents the letter. With both hands, no words are spoken. The moment is quiet, almost ceremonial. The receiver takes the folded letter, recognizes the scent, a delicate trace of plum blossom oil, and knows instantly who it's from. The courier doesn't linger. He has other stops, other messages, other silences to deliver. Inside the house, the letter is opened, slowly, carefully. There are no knives, no hasty fingers. The knot is untied. The folds are unfolded, one by one, as though peeling back the layers of time. And then, finally, the ink is revealed. By now the writing may have smudged, or faded, or soaked ever so slightly into the paper from damp air or a sweaty sleeve. But the words are there, elegant curves, gently slanted kana, maybe a Chinese character or two to emphasize rank or emotion. The reader reads once, then again, not out loud. This is a private moment. The letter, though brief, becomes a place to rest one's thoughts. And now a decision must be made. Do they write back? Or do they wait, as etiquette sometimes demands, for the ink to metaphorically settle? In the Heian world, the speed of a reply could say as much as the words within it. Too quick, and you seemed eager. Too slow, and you risked insult. Too poetic, and your meaning might be misread. Too plain, and you risked seeming cold or unsophisticated. Every element mattered. The ink color, the paper weight, the number of folds, even the scent. It was like playing a long-distance game of Go, except the board was silence, and the pieces were made of longing. But behind all this elegance, behind the layers of etiquette and poetry, there was something very real. The labor of communication, the slow grind of ink, the aching legs of the courier, the cracked hands of the station keeper who fed and watered the horses, the creased brow of the court official reviewing grain reports in triplicate, hand-copied by junior scribes, the monk at the roadside temple who carried news of a land dispute on behalf of his abbey, tucked into a scroll case strapped to his back. Even the grandest of Heian letters, written on gold-dusted paper in a noblewoman's hand, passed through ordinary, lives to reach its destination. Letters were not just cultural expressions, they were physical objects, they were vulnerable. Paper in Heian Japan was often handmade, its fibers pressed from mulberry bark or gampi shrubs, dried on boards in the sun, and hand-cut with tools passed down across generations. A single letter might have taken weeks to prepare, from tree to brush to seal. Some letters never made it to human hands. They were sent instead to the gods at shrines and temples. People wrote messages on thin strips of wood or paper, or ofuda, and hung them on trees or burned them in sacred fires. These weren't personal letters, but spiritual ones, requests for good harvests, healed illnesses, or safe travels. They too were folded, tied, and sent. Only their destination was not a noble's estate, but the unseen realm of deities and spirits. In a way, they followed the same logic, words carried carefully, with hope, into the unknown. By the late Heian period, more and more writing was being copied and archived. The great temples at Nara, for instance, kept meticulous records, donation logs, land deeds, imperial decrees, all written by hand, stored in scroll racks and wooden chests. Writing, once the province of the elite, was spreading outward. Regional officials were expected to read and write. Some commoners, particularly those who worked with monks, learned as well. The letter was no longer just an aristocratic pastime, it was becoming part of administration, of order. And so the couriers kept walking, quietly, patiently, carrying letters in all directions, north to the snowy provinces, south to the warmer islands, inland through forests, out along riverbanks where red boats waited to cross. One courier, perhaps, died along the way. A sudden fever, a fall from a cliff. The letter never arrived. Another made it home, handed off the reply, and slept for a full day without rising. Another delivered a scroll that changed the fate of a small province, a land grant, finally approved. After years of silence, and some messages, inevitably, never found their intended reader, a recipient who had moved, a noblewoman who had taken vows and entered a convent, a house destroyed by fire. The courier, unsure what to do, might have left the letter with a monk, or tied it to a branch in the forest, or burned it out of respect. Centuries later, buried in the storage room of a temple, historians would find a tightly folded letter, still scented faintly with something floral, still bearing the brushwork of someone long gone. They'd gently unfold it, whisper the characters aloud, and try to imagine the hands that wrote it. And so it makes you wonder, in a world where letters could be so easily lost, stolen, delayed, or destroyed, why did people keep writing them? Maybe the act of writing was never really about being heard. Maybe it was about the hope that someone, somewhere, someday, might listen tonight. We leave behind scrolls and silk sleeves and step into a muddier world, where royal orders slogged across the rain-soaked fields of early medieval England, where messengers wrapped in rough wool trudged through wet forests, clutching wax tablets beneath their cloaks. A world where even the king's word had to wait for the weather. Welcome to Anglo-Saxon England, not the romanticized land of gallant knights and shining armor, but something older, colder, and altogether more inconvenient. The 9th and 10th centuries brought kingdoms like Wessex, Mercia, and Northumbria into uneasy prominence. Each had its own king, its own court, and its own laws. But what they didn't have was reliable communication. So how did a king, perhaps Alfred, sitting in a smoky hall with a carved oak chair and a belly full of mead, send orders to a village 80 miles away? Not with trumpets, nor carrier pigeons, nor anything as organized as a postal system. No, he'd reach for a stylus and a wax tablet, scratch out his message, and send a man. Just a man, on foot, likely alone, with no map, no boots, and not much more than the memory of where the road ought to be. That man might be a servant, or a monk, or a reeve, which was a kind of local official, somewhere between a bailiff and a glorified errand boy. But whoever he was, he'd walk. Sometimes for days, sometimes longer, through mud thick enough to suck the shoe off his foot, through woods where outlaws lurked, over streams with no bridges, sleeping under trees or in barns, or, if he was lucky, in a local abbey that happened to owe some kindness to the king. You see, letters in Anglo-Saxon England weren't just about words. They were about loyalty, obligation. You didn't write to strangers. You didn't send messages without a chain of relationships to guarantee delivery. That's why clergy were so often used, because they were trusted, educated, and largely stationary. If you wanted to send a message from Winchester to York, you'd probably hand it to a bishop or someone from his household. He'd make the arrangements, perhaps tasking a junior monk or an obedient scribe to carry it forward. And they, in turn, would rely on the kindness of the next monastery on the path. This system, if you could call it that, was mostly made up of favors. Abbeys received food or protection from the crown, and in return, they served the king's communication needs. They copied letters, delivered messages, kept records. The message might arrive smudged or late or distorted by retelling, but eventually someone would arrive and say, "The king says," or "the bishop has requested," or "a thane was murdered, and justice must be done." And that was enough now. Imagine the letter itself, not delicate parchment, but a wax tablet, about the size of a modern paperback, filled with dark wax and scratched over with a metal or wooden stylus. The message could be erased and reused, but often it was fragile. A poorly handled tablet might crack or smear. If privacy was essential, the tablet could be sealed with string and wax, and marked with a stamp, the impression of a ring or signet pressed deep into the surface. But still, anything too long or too detailed needed to be remembered as much as written. Some messengers carried oral instructions alongside the tablet. The tablet contained the formal words, but the meaning, the nuance, the urgency that had to be spoken, passed down like a half-remembered song. Tell the alderman that winter taxes must be paid early. Remind the reeve to send 3 men to serve in the ford. Say that the king is angry, but not so angry that mercy is out of the question. There was always room for interpretation, and there were delays, long ones, because while the were many things, skilled farmers, devout Christians, surprisingly good at boat building, they were not fast. Roads, such as they were, followed Roman paths that had long since crumbled. Weather ruled everything. A message sent in November might not arrive until spring. Snow, flooding, or simple distance could halt everything. This wasn't negligence. It was simply the condition of medieval life, and so kings learned to be patient, or to send multiple messengers, or to rely on local lords to act without waiting for written word. The crown's authority was only as strong as its ability to reach people, and often that meant waiting for the man with the wax tablet to show up, soaked and shivering, in a village where no one had even heard his name. Sometimes messages had to be read aloud, not just for ceremony, but because few people could read. A gathering would be called, and the messenger would stand before a hearth, or beneath a tree, and read, from King Edward to the men of this 100, and people would nod, or grumble, or ask for it to be read again. The message would become part of village memory, passed from person to person, altered by accents and forgetfulness. There were no archives, no backups. If the wax cracked or the stylus snapped, the words were gone. And so every message was something alive, flickering briefly in time before vanishing. Now dim your thoughts a little, and imagine you're the messenger. You've left the king's hall 2 days ago. The wind is cruel, the hills are soggy. Your cloak smells of wet wool and stale bread. You've been muttering the message to yourself all day, just in case the tablet gets ruined. You know the names. Beornwulf, Iljeeth, Osric. You know what to say. You've said it 100 times in your head. You pass a hedgerow, and a woman stares at you from her doorway. She doesn't ask your name. She doesn't need to. She knows by your gait, your clothes, your clutching hand that you're carrying something. Not food, not coin, but orders. And maybe that's enough to be let in. Given a bench by the fire, a slice of rye bread, a moment's rest, and as you fall asleep, the wax still safe in your cloak, you wonder, what will they think when they read it? You're awake before sunrise. The fire is cold, the bench hard, and your knees ache. You check your bundle. The wax tablet is still there, wrapped in linen, the seal unbroken. The woman who gave you shelter is already tending to her sheep, and you thank her with a quiet nod before trudging back onto the path. Such was the rhythm of a royal messenger's. Life in Anglo-Saxon England, half memory, half mud. Messages didn't move with the urgency we expect today. They wandered like pilgrims. They paused at crossroads, waited out rains, were stalled by flooded rivers and overturned carts. And yet, somehow, they got there in the early Anglo-Saxon period. Most messages, especially between kings or across regions, travelled not as letters, but as people. A king might dispatch a trusted thane or reeve, not just with a tablet or scroll, but with full authority to speak on his behalf. These envoys weren't always literate. They didn't need to be. They needed to know names, faces, the right greeting for a bishop, and the right tone for a belligerent thane. They were the voice of the king on 2 legs. But as the centuries went on, especially into the 9th and 10th centuries, writing began to catch up. Monastic schools, encouraged by rulers like Alfred the Great, spread literacy among the clergy and some nobility. Latin was the language of learning, but Old English was used in laws, land, charters, and correspondence. And with more literacy came more writing, and with more writing came more messengers. This brought with it a strange balance. On one hand, the kingdom needed speed, orders for taxes, summons to court, news of raids. On the other, the tools of writing were slow. Wax tablets were reused until the surface wore thin. Parchment was expensive, made from animal skins stretched, scraped, and treated over weeks. Ink came from oak galls, mixed with iron salts. Pens were hand-cut reeds or goose quills, and every document required thought, care, and the presence of someone who actually knew how to form a decent letter G. So letters weren't dashed off, they were events, and even when they were finally written, they rarely travelled alone. A letter from a king might be accompanied by a token, a knife, a belt, a piece of cloth to signify the seriousness of the command. Some were tied with twine and sealed with wax, the king's ring pressed deep into the blob. Others were simply folded and tucked into the messenger's cloak, their authority resting in the sender's name rather than any ornamentation. The journey itself was perilous. Bandits roamed the woods, particularly in the unsettled borderlands between kingdoms. If a messenger carried something valuable, even a letter stamped with royal wax, he risked theft. Not because the message was worth anything to the thief, but because the thief didn't care A man traveling alone was just another body to rob. To avoid trouble, messengers often took known paths, old Roman roads when possible, or forest tracks marked with prayer stones or carved boundary markers. They sought shelter at churches, abbeys, or estates of known allies. Hospitality was expected, especially for a man carrying orders from a bishop or king. But expectations didn't always align with reality. A reeve with a grudge might slam at the door, a minor noble might delay the message out of spite. A drunk local might demand the message be read aloud, whether it was meant for him or not, and all the while the messenger had to keep the words safe, whether etched in wax, inked on vellum, or memorized line by line. Now let's pause here, in the middle of this journey, and look at a particular example, a charter from King Aethelstan, dated around 931. This wasn't a mere letter, but a royal land grant, written in Latin, decorated with formulaic blessings, and signed by multiple witnesses. It would have been copied by monks, read aloud at a gathering of nobles, and then sent, likely with a messenger, to the landholder in question. That landholder, once receiving it, might have kissed the parchment, or folded it into a chest, or buried it beneath an altar. It was more than a message. It was proof of favor, proof of law, proof that the king, distant though he was, had reached them. But most communication wasn't so grand. Much of it was smaller, rougher, more forgettable, a summons to court, a notice of tithes, a warning about raids. These messages, delivered by tired feet and spoken by hoarse voices, didn't survive the centuries. They vanished into memory. But they were no less vital. At times, even the clergy themselves served as couriers. An abbey might dispatch a young monk to deliver a copied sermon to a nearby church. A bishop might send a priest with instructions for a feast day ritual. Some of these clerics traveled with their writing tools, ink, horn, stylus, bits of parchment tucked into leather satchels. They could draft a reply or make a copy along the road, using borrowed benches and borrowed light. And yet there were delays, always delays. A snowstorm in Wessex could mean a message wouldn't reach Mercia for weeks. A plague might shut down a monastery. A Viking raid might scatter a whole village, and the messenger along with it. In such cases, the message wasn't just delayed. It was lost to the fog of war and weather. It might resurface months later, in a cracked box at the edge of a field, unread and irrelevant. And what of the messengers themselves? Most remain nameless. Their footsteps left no trace. A few, like the reeves mentioned in the Doomsday Book centuries later, are listed only by roll, not by what they carried, but by how much land they held in return for doing so. Their value was not in the message but in the service, and in the belief that someone, somewhere, would walk across England with nothing but a tablet, a name, and the willingness to deliver both. So much authority depended not on armies or proclamations, but on one man walking through mud. The future of a law, the fate of a farm, the recall of a knight, all of it balanced on the sturdiness of his shoes and the steadiness of his memory. And when that man finally arrived, dripping, exhausted, squinting through smoke, and spoke the king's words aloud, how did they listen? Were they grateful, resentful, suspicious, or had they long since given up expecting word at all? By now, your boots are cracked. The soles flap when you walk. The wax tablet has softened from your body heat, and you've had to retie the seal 3 times. Your route has taken you through 2 flooded fords, a monastery that refused to let you in, and a hamlet where a boy threw a cabbage at your back. Still, you walk. And when you finally arrive, weeks later, maybe longer, you don't begin with a grand speech. You wipe your hands, you bow, if appropriate, and then you speak the name of the man who sent you, as clearly and evenly as you can manage. Because for all the cold, the grime, the danger, and the boredom, this moment is what it's all for. This was the slow heartbeat of governance in Anglo-Saxon England. Nothing moved quickly. Nothing was easy. Yet it worked in its own staggered, plodding way. When a message arrived, it wasn't simply read and discarded. In many cases, it was read aloud, perhaps by a priest or a literate noble in the presence of witnesses. A royal charter might be displayed during a village moot. A bishop's decree could be recited in the nave after Sunday prayers. Even a simple land dispute ruling might be passed from house to house, memorized by elders, and discussed at length over warm ale. Because there were so few messages, each one carried enormous weight. People remembered them. They recited them. For years, some ended up carved into stone markers or inscribed on church walls. Others were stored in wooden chests, tied with cord and dusted with ashes, in case they were ever needed again. And when disputes did arise, as they always did, those same letters and messengers became evidence. In one 10th century case, a man named Wulfgar claimed a parcel of land based on a charter given to his father by King Edmund. The charter, brought forth by a monk and read in court, named the land, its boundaries, and its conditions. There was argument, of course there always was, but in the end, the written word held. The king's message had travelled, and it still had power. Yet despite their importance, these deliveries remained terribly fragile. A messenger could fall ill. A document could be soaked, torn, or eaten by rats. Wax seals melted in summer heat. Dogs chewed through vellum. The wrong pronunciation of a name could offend a noble or confuse an elder. And if a letter was delayed long enough, it could become irrelevant altogether. A death, a change of season, a king's reversal. Time was as much an enemy as weather or wolves. To help mitigate this, some monasteries and royal courts developed rudimentary systems. Not quite a postal network, but a memory of who travelled where. A monk in Worcester might know to send a document to Malmesbury through a particular priest who visited monthly. A royal thane in Winchester might entrust multiple copies of a decree to different messengers, ensuring at least one would make it through. But it was still improvisation. Unlike the sophisticated systems of the Abbasid, Caliphate, or the Tang dynasty, where trained riders carried mail on relay horses, England had no such infrastructure. Roads were poor, bridges unreliable. Horses were expensive and reserved for nobles. Most messages moved on foot, one slow body at a time. And so, it's little wonder that monasteries became the quiet epicenters of this world. They had scribes, inks, storage, memory. A letter might be written in Canterbury, walked to Ely, copied by a monk there, and then passed onward. These abbeys became living archives, not only for holy texts, but for charters, decrees, and correspondence between bishops and kings. They preserved what the roads could not. There's a small piece of parchment, now housed in the British Library, bearing a letter from a bishop to a landowner. It's no larger than a hand. The writing is uneven. The ink has faded. The message itself is ordinary, a reminder of a tithe, a gentle rebuke for delay. But what's remarkable is the signature, a simple cross, drawn with care. We don't know who carried it, or how long it took to arrive, or whether the landowner obeyed, All we know is that someone wrote it, someone else read it, and between them, a path was carved. That's how governance worked then. Not through speed, but through persistence. Not through bureaucracy, but through trust. The system bent, but rarely broke. Even in times of war, messengers still moved. When Edward the Elder fought the Danes, letters had to be sent to coordinate levies and arrange provisions. When the Lady of the Mercians fortified towns across her realm, word had to be spread, sometimes in writing, sometimes by mouth, sometimes by a man shouting on horseback before galloping on to the next village. By the 11th century, just before the Norman conquest, things began to shift. William would bring with him not only new rulers, but a more centralized view of record-keeping and command. The Doomsday Survey would catalogue the entire realm, parchment by parchment, clerk by clerk. But before that, long before that, it was all monks, messengers, and mud. The voices of kings travelled slowly, one weary footstep at a time, and yet the words always seemed to arrive, not always on time, not always to the right person, but arrive they did, tucked inside cloaks, scratched into wax, or spoken by memory in smoke-filled halls. So next time you find yourself annoyed at a delayed text or a missed email, imagine trudging across Wessex in the rain with a damp letter under your tunic and a dog barking at your heels. Wouldn't you rather wait a few more minutes? The air is dry, the stars endless, and the only sounds are the faint groans of a camel's gait and the soft shush of wind over parchment. We're far from Anglo-Saxon rain, far from Japanese hills. We're somewhere between Cairo and the edge of the Red Sea, where bureaucracy travelled not by road but by rhythm, the rhythm of hoof, script, and schedule. Fatimid Egypt in the 10th and 11th centuries was many things, a centre of learning, a trade crossroads, and an empire ruled with administrative precision. But perhaps more than anything, it was a civilization bound together by letters. So many letters, decrees, orders, reports, responses, tax records, and requests, all flowing from the heart of Cairo, like veins pumping from a central mind. And yet, despite its power and reach, there was no quickness in it. Everything about the Fatimid communication system was deliberate, formal and slow, gloriously, wonderfully slow. You wouldn't write your own letter, of course. That was a job for trained scribes, men who had studied not only grammar and calligraphy, but the correct phrases of address for different ranks. An error in greeting, too informal or too grand, could be taken as an insult. A missing phrase could nullify the entire meaning. And so these scribes worked in the Diwan Olinj, the Bureau of Correspondence, a long hall or a cluster of rooms near the center of Fatimid administration. It was quiet, cool, if they were lucky. Parchments were stored in bundles by topic and region. Scribes sat cross-legged, heads bowed, ink flowing. Each document had a beginning, a middle, and an ending, much like a prayer, except this one might go to a governor in Aleppo or a tax inspector in Upper Egypt. Some letters were written on papyrus, others on parchment, depending on formality and storage needs. Wax was rarely used. Instead, important letters bore the alama, the caliphal emblem, or invocation applied by a specialist in the chancery. It was both signature and symbol, branding the page with authority, but writing was only the beginning. Getting the letter to its destination, that was the real challenge. The Fatimid postal system, the bird, was one of the most intricate in the medieval Islamic world. But intricate did not mean fast. Camels were the primary couriers for longer routes, especially those heading into the deserts of the Hijaz, the Levant, or North Africa. Horses were faster, yes, but they tired quickly and needed more water. Camels, on the other hand, could plod along for days with little rest, not briskly, but steadily. Imagine this: it's noon, the sun hangs above the city like a lid. In a shaded courtyard outside Cairo's administrative quarter, a camel kneels, grumbling softly as a satchel of letters is tied to its side. A rider mounts, not a soldier, but a professional courier, trained in navigation, letter handling, and discretion. He nods to a clerk, takes a skin of water, and sets off, south toward Al-Fayyim, or west toward Alexandria, or perhaps northeast toward Palestine. There are way stations, the Khns and Manzil, every 30 or 40 miles. Here, a rider might rest, replace his mount, or hand over the satchel to another courier for the next leg of the journey. These stops were also postal hubs, often manned by state officials who logged incoming and outgoing dispatches, checked seals, and sometimes even intercepted or delayed letters depending on priority, but delays weren't just administrative. The desert itself was slow. Sandstorms could halt travel for days. Flash floods in dry wadis could sweep away entire caravans. Bandits, though rare on main roads, were a real threat along the fringes. Letters, even sealed with colourful marks, were not immune to theft, loss, or misdirection. And yet, the bureaucracy planned for this. Important communications were copied once, twice, sometimes 3 times, and sent via different routes. One copy through the inland desert, one by sea from Alexandria, carried on a trade ship to Tripoli or Sidon, another through a longer overland route. Delays were expected. What mattered was that the word arrived, eventually, and when it did. A governor might gather his advisors. The caliph's letter would be read aloud, in full, with no interruptions. Phrases like "May the blessings of the Prophet be upon you" would be recited solemnly, even if everyone already knew what the letter contained. In the courtly world of the Fatimids, form was substance. The letter might include instructions on tax collection quotas, or updates on court politics, or even news of celestial events, eclipses, comets, rare alignments, which were always of interest to rulers guided by both religion and astrology. A well-timed eclipse could justify a tax relief or a troop movement. After all, what is a state letter but an attempt to explain the heavens in paper? And then, once the message had been received and discussed, the process reversed. A response would be written, reviewed, sealed, sent. Another camel, another rider, another sigh beneath the desert sun. This endless loop of correspondence formed the pulse of the empire. Fatimid rule stretched from Tunisia to the Red Sea, and yet somehow it held together, not with radio, not with trains, but with a dozen sand-worn leather bags, bumping along the backs of tired animals. It's tempting to imagine this system as hopelessly inefficient. But it wasn't. It was slow. Yes, sometimes agonizingly so, but it was built on consistency and control. A letter might take a month, but when it arrived, it mattered. When it was read, people listened. When it was answered with care. And in that slow drip of parchment and ink, power flowed. What would you write if you knew it might take 40 days to arrive, and 40 more to hear back? What kind of words would be worth the wait? The courier never rushed. Even with the weight of a caliph's orders slung over the camel's flank, Haste wasn't part of the job. There was no sprinting through the desert, no galloping toward glory. Just the measured, stubborn rhythm of progress. One hoof, then another. A letter making its way across sand and time. The men behind the letters, the scribes, clerks, and riders, were not the ones remembered in chronicles. But without them, nothing functioned. A tax edict that never reached its governor was as useless as one never written. And if a command to dispatch troops took too long to arrive, an entire province might be lost. And yet, the system survived. Not despite its slowness, but because of it, in many ways. The postal network reflected the very ideology of the Fatimid state order. Control, hierarchy, and deliberation. The Fatimid Caliphate was an Ismaili Shia regime, a dynasty that claimed direct descent from the Prophet's daughter, Fatima. Cairo, their shining capital, was more than just a city. It was a symbol of divine authority, of learned governance, of calm in a chaotic world. The name itself, Al-Qira, means the victorious. So when letters departed from Cairo's central chancery, they were more than messages. They were extensions of the caliph's will, embodied authority. Their journey through the heat and dust wasn't incidental. It was a performance of power, and that performance was full of protocol. For instance, the alama, the caliphal emblem, wasn't just a rubber stamp. It was a carefully written, symbolic invocation of God's name or the ruler's titles. A senior scribe would inscribe it by hand using special ink and a stylized script unique to the court. It might contain phrases like Bismi, Lahay al-Ramen, Ara M, or Alim al-Ma, M, Ujat al, Ha, Fr, I, affirming both divine legitimacy and absolute rule. The presence of the alama on a letter rendered it inviolable. Couriers, regardless of their station, were not to open it. Scribes who touched such documents underwent special training, not only in penmanship but in etiquette. Their posture, their phrasing, their ink, it all mattered. The caliph's word deserved reverence at every step, but things didn't always go to plan. Let's follow a letter, perhaps from the year 1027, addressed to a Fatimid military governor in Barca, along the Libyan coast. It leaves Cairo wrapped in cloth, sealed tight, its calligraphy perfect. The courier takes the western route, passing through Giza, then along the narrow coastal road. Days pass. A sandstorm delays travel near Alexandria. At a roadside kitchen, the satchel is rechecked, but the official is illiterate, a local hire, and fails to log the letter correctly. A week later, another delay, a sick camel, then a flash flood near Masa, Matruh. By the time the letter arrives in Barca, it's been 17 days. The governor opens it under formal conditions. In a small court chamber, attendants on either side. He reads it slowly. It requests reinforcements be sent to Tripoli within 10 days. 10 days, but 17 have already passed. So the governor drafts a response, respectful, thorough, explaining the delays, affirming loyalty, and suggesting alternative measures. He doesn't blame the system. That would be unthinkable. Instead, he writes, "By the grace of God and the insight of the IMG, I remain at your command, though the sands have moved faster than the hooves this time." Another courier sets off, retracing the route back to Cairo. The message arrives. The Fatimid Caliphate was an Ismaili Shia regime, a dynasty that claimed direct descent from the Prophet's daughter, Fatima, through her husband Alq. That bloodline wasn't just a religious claim. It was the state's spine, and the slow-moving letters that crept across the deserts carried more than policy. They carried legitimacy. Every directive from Cairo wasn't merely a command, it was a reaffirmation of divine right. The tone of each letter was reverent, polished, often invoking lineage and destiny, as if to remind distant governors and officers, you answer not just to a ruler, but to a legacy. And so the letters had to look the part. The chancery in Cairo. The Diwan Orange maintained meticulous attention to aesthetic detail. The script used for official documents was not rushed. The angular Kufic, reserved for more decorative or religious inscriptions, was replaced here by more practical but still elegant hands, like Naskh or cursive Maghrib, depending on region and recipient. Ink was mixed, fresh from soot and gum, and paper, a relatively new material, adopted from earlier Abbasid and Chinese models, was treated and smoothed by hand. Margins were respected. Spacing was neat. A letter from the Caliphate had to look and feel like a letter from the Caliphate. Even folding mattered. Certain letters were folded once, others in thirds, depending on rank. The alama, the caliphal mark, not a wax seal, but a phrase or emblem, often invoking divine blessing, would be written prominently, sometimes at the head, other times at the end. This mark wasn't just a formality, it was authentication, an early version of a royal watermark. Tampering with it was a serious offense, punishable by imprisonment or worse. There were even formal manuals on how correspondence should be written. Some have survived. Administrative treatises laying out the proper opening lines for different situations. How to open a letter to a military officer. How to rebuke a corrupt tax official. How to mourn a provincial loss without admitting state weakness. Letter writing, in other words, was a science of shadows, polite, veiled. Political, but delivery, the other half of the system, was all about logistics. Let's return to the desert. A courier from Cairo might be carrying half a dozen letters, each tucked into individual leather packets, oiled to resist sand and water. Some were wrapped in linen. More important ones were double. A tiny iron key might accompany the packet, meant for a chest at a distant administrative outpost, where only that letter's recipient would unlock and read it. The courier knew the stops. He'd ridden this path before, maybe not in this exact sequence, but enough to know the rhythm of the journey. South of Cairo, along the Nile's edge, the stops were frequent. Small towns like Asi or Chu, each with its own postmaster, someone trained in letter handling, but also in people. Discretion was important. Couriers didn't gossip, at least not in public. But as the terrain shifted from the green ribbon of the Nile, valley into harsher highlands, or out into western expanses, the gaps between stops widened. In some parts of Upper Egypt, days might pass between stations. Water was rationed. Camels groaned and spat. Letters were reshuffled, prioritized. If a packet looked near ruin, the postmaster would rewrap it, reseal it, and send a brief note explaining the intervention. There were rules. No one opened a letter unless authorized. No one read a caliphal command aloud without formal assembly. Even the act of receiving a letter, standing, listening, bowing, had ceremony. In a state so dependent on writing, every stage of the process was infused with meaning. And letters didn't just travel south or east. Some went west, all the way to Ifriqiya, modern-day Tunisia, where the Fatimids had originally established their dynasty before moving to Egypt. The trip from Cairo to Mahdia, for example, could take up to 6 weeks, involving desert rides, coastal boats, and a brief overland march through uncertain terrain. Each stage had its own risks, storms, ship delays, missed connections, and yet it worked. Over time, local administrators developed systems for anticipating the mail. They'd assign scribes to wait near known arrival days, based on how long a journey usually took. If a courier was more than a week overdue, the station might send a scout back down the path, not in panic, just in cautious inquiry, and still, sometimes, a letter simply vanished, whether lost to a sandstorm, stolen by opportunists, or misrouted by human error. A packet could disappear. In that case, the response was deliberate. The chancery in Cairo would wait. If no confirmation came after a certain time, a copy of the letter, made at the time of writing, precisely for this possibility, would be dispatched again through another route. The loss might be noted, but rarely investigated further. The sands took what they would take, but not every letter was political. Many were mundane reports on irrigation, grain storage, market prices. A town magistrate might write to ask whether a tax break could be granted after an early flood ruined the date harvest. A judge in Omahala might send updates on a legal dispute over land rights, and sometimes personal letters threaded there, waved through the official lines, slipped quietly into a satchel by a well-placed bureaucrat, addressed to a cousin, a brother, a scholar. These personal letters were written more plainly, but often with deeper feeling. They told of illnesses, marriages, droughts, dreams. They spoke of longing for Cairo's bustle, or wishing for the cool air of the Sinai hills. They rarely reached their destination quickly, but they were read slowly, with care, sometimes aloud, sometimes more than once. In a world where travel was perilous and voices distant, the written word was everything. And what did it feel like to receive one of these letters? Not as a governor, but as an ordinary man, perhaps a merchant, or a minor clerk who hadn't heard from his brother in many months. To see the courier arrive, dusty and tired, to be handed a folded square, still smelling faintly of camel hide and ink, to unfold it slowly and read the curves of handwriting that echoed someone far away. There was magic in that dot, not the kind with sparks and spectacle, but the quiet kind, the kind that moves slowly on its own time through wind and heat and border posts, and all of it, every piece, moved through the slow, patient hands of the Fatimid postal world. What might have been lost in those deserts, never to be read again. What promises, orders, or names were swallowed by sand. Somewhere near the Red Sea, a lone courier knelt beside his camel, dusting sand off a letter pouch. It was just after dawn, and the desert had not yet decided to become unbearable. There was time to eat a little bread, sip from a goatskin of water, and consult the slate hung from the saddle, a list of waypoints, names, and scribbled notes passed down from the station master in Kift. The sun would rise higher soon. The wind would stir with teeth. But for now, the courier had letters to deliver, and a predictable path to follow. The Fatimid Empire didn't survive because of fast communication. It survived because of regularity, of expectation, because someone always was walking, or riding, or coasting in a small boat, a priver, with a message sealed in paper and ink in Cairo. The chancery was still humming by the 11th century. The Fatimid Diwan system had reached a kind of bureaucratic crescendo. Dozens of scribes worked under the vizier's guidance, most of them educated in both Arabic, grammar, and etiquette. These were not merely literate men. They were trained in statecraft through writing. They knew how to imply displeasure without direct insult, how to praise while issuing commands, how to mirror the tone of the Caliph himself behind their desks. They prepared duplicates of everything, an entire archive of paper stored in scrolls or folded sheets, neatly labeled and indexed. If a letter to the governor of Alexandria disappeared, there was another. If a merchant claimed he never received his license, a copy could be produced. This was, by medieval standards, a marvel of clerical precision, but it was not eternal. Outside of Cairo's walls, things were changing. The Mediterranean was shifting. New dynasties were rising. The Seljuks in the east, the Normans in Sicily, the Crusaders beginning to dream of conquest. The Fatimids, surrounded on multiple fronts, leaned even harder into their bureaucracy, as if the right letter sent to the right man might hold back the tide. Still, the postal system persisted. Even during periods of military unrest, skirmishes near the Levant, rebellions in Africa, the letters flowed. Routes were adjusted, riders diverted, but communication was never abandoned. In one recorded instance, a courier took nearly 4 months to deliver an order to the governor of Barca in Cyrenaica. When he arrived, dusty and barely upright, he still performed the ritual of delivery. A bowed head, a spoken phrase, a quiet moment while the letter was accepted. It had taken him 13 stops and 2 broken camels to reach his destination. And the message, it was about grain prices. Still, it mattered. Fatimid letters weren't just communication, they were proof of presence. A message from Cairo meant the Caliph still watched, still cared, still ruled, no matter how far away the province. To fall out of the postal loop was, in a sense, to fall out of the empire. But the system had its limits by the mid-12th century. Internal divisions, financial strain, and external pressures began to fray the edges. The Crusaders were now fully present in the Levant, disrupting trade and travel. Rival caliphates competed for religious legitimacy. The Fatimids, once strong and self-assured, found their postal system stretched thinner. Messages were still written, but delays grew longer. Letters were still sent, but responses came less often. The chain of trust began to rattle, and yet, through all this, the camels still walked. The stations still operated, some official, some now privately funded by merchants or guilds who relied on the network for business. The route maps were redrawn. By hand, the scribes adapted their phrasing to suit new realities. A letter might take twice as long, but it would arrive eventually. And that, in itself, was a kind of miracle. Even when Cairo finally fell under Ayyubid control in 1171, with Saladin officially ending the Fatimid Caliphate, much of the communication infrastructure remained in place. The bureaucracy proved more durable than the dynasty that built it. Why? Because it was boring. It was unglamorous, paper-stuffed, rule-bound work that no conqueror saw fit to destroy. Instead, the post was folded into new hands, repurposed, updated. But the bones, the camels, the routes, the scribes, stayed more or less intact. The empire may have changed, but the letters still moved, and that's the quiet legacy of the Fatimid postal world. Not conquest, not splendor, but routine, habit. Thousands of unremarkable messages written in steady hands, dispatched into heat and silence, trusted to reach a reader who may or may not be waiting. We rarely remember these letters. The grand narratives of history tend to focus on swords and crowns, not stamps and seals. But without that paper trail, even the loudest declarations would fade into dust. What matters more, really, the shout or the echo that endures. What was the last letter ever written in the name of a Fatimid caliph? Did it arrive too late? Far to the north, beyond the forests of birch and pine, where rivers thickened into ice during the long winters and wooden houses leaned quietly under snow, lay the principalities of early Rus. Here, letters were not sealed with wax and handed off to a galloping courier in crisp uniform. They moved, instead, in the shadows of sleighs, wrapped in wool, or tucked inside a boot beside a loaf of rye bread and a carved wooden comb. It was not a land of efficiency or speed, but it was threaded with movement, careful, slow, and persistent. There was no state-run courier service in Kievan Rus, no permanent network of riders or stations like the caliphates. Instead, letters traveled through a patchwork of people, monks, traders, pilgrims, servants, anyone moving from one settlement to another. The system worked, not by organization, but by trust. A message reached its destination because someone agreed to carry it, and someone else agreed to pass it along. In the city of Novgorod, built along the Volkhov River, messages might begin their journey. It was a place of trade and timbered homes, where children learned to read not from parchment but from scraps of wood and softened bark. Writing in early Rus was a quiet skill, most often learned through the church, but also passed down in workshops and family homes. And the most common material, not expensive vellum, was birch. Birch-bark, stripped from young trees and soaked until pliable, was everywhere. It could be folded, scratched, carried easily, and later discarded or hidden. People etched their thoughts into it, using a metal stylus or a small knife, short notes, instructions, prayers, and sometimes scoldings. A father might write to his brother in Kiev to send salt. A merchant might send word that the river crossing near Smolensk was flooded. A boy might practice his alphabet, repeating the same letter over and over in careful rows. Much later, in the damp soil of Novgorod, more than 1,000 of these birch-barked letters would be found, preserved under layers of clay. Some were simple, business transactions. Some were requests. One said, "From Mikula to Foma, I sent you linen, send me a pot." Another, "The children are hungry, come home." They were not written to be remembered, and yet they were. Once a message was written, the question became how to send it. There was no courier office, no registry, but people traveled, always across the rivers and forests of Rus. They traveled for trade, for pilgrimage, for politics, for survival. A monk might be walking from a monastery near Rostov to Kiev. A tanner might be delivering leather goods to the prince's court. These were the people who became messengers. If you needed to send a letter, you asked. You asked a neighbor, a trader, or a visiting relative. You handed off the bark note and hoped it would arrive. Winter helped, strangely. In the warmer months, travel was unpredictable. Roads turned to mud, rivers swelled, forest paths disappeared into thickets. But in winter, rivers froze solid, and sleighs could pass quickly over them. The Dnip, the Volkhov, the Desna, these waterways became the highways of letters. Still, it was slow. Messages took weeks or months. There were no guarantees. A note might get wet and crumble. A messenger might fall ill or stop short of the destination. But people kept writing, not because they were certain of arrival, but because the message mattered. Sometimes it wasn't a letter, but a word passed along orally, repeated by memory. Other times, a message was scratched quickly in the margins of a wax tablet, melted and reused days later. But the birch-bark notes, those were special. They could be folded, tucked, passed from hand to hand, without the message fading. Most letters came from towns. Literacy was rare in the countryside, and those who could write often lived near churches, in urban households, or at courts. Kiev, the glittering center of the realm, received many letters, political, personal, and spiritual. A scribe at the princely court might transcribe a formal edict, carefully worded and sanctified. A wife might send her husband word that the crops were poor, or that a new baby had been born. A brother might warn of rumors spreading apriver, and sometimes a reply came. There were no set routes. Letters didn't follow straight lines. A note from Novgorod to Kiev might pass through Pskov, then Smolensk, then into the hands of someone headed south. Monasteries served as way stations, offering shelter to the traveling bearer of news. Traders moved goods, but they also moved words. Information was cargo. Even among nobles and officials, the system was informal. A prince might send a message by trusted servant or monk, with no record kept beyond the knowledge of its sender. Authority depended not on a paper trail, but on memory and reputation. Sometimes, scribes included appeals in their letters. Please reply when you are able. Sometimes, they waited months for an answer, and sometimes silence was all that returned. Yet the habit persisted. Children in Novgorod carved letters into bark to practice the alphabet. A teenager wrote a love note. A merchant sent word of delayed shipments. The messages varied, but the rhythm stayed the same, slow, deliberate, and built on the fragile hope that what was written might be seen by another set of eyes. The birch, of course, was never intended to last. Most of it disintegrated with time. But for those who received the letters, the impact was immediate. A message arriving in deep winter, after weeks of snowbound quiet, was more than news. It was connection, a reminder that the world stretched beyond the village gate, that someone else, far away, had thought of you. Perhaps this is why people kept sending letters, even when the roads were impassable, the rivers swollen, the forest full of wolves. They wrote anyway, because communication in early Rus was never about certainty. It was about resilience. It was about carving meaning into a world of snow, and so, a question lingers. What kind of message would you still send, even if you knew it might never arrive? In the lands of Kievan Rus, where travel was more a matter of patience than planning, the journey of a letter was rarely linear. It often meandered, like the rivers that carved their way through snow and pine. And if Section 1 showed us how messages might begin, scratched onto birch bark, wrapped in wool, handed to a passing trader, then perhaps it's time to follow one of those letters on its uncertain, frost-bitten path. Let's say it begins in Novgorod, a city of craftsmen and wet wooden lanes, with wide log houses and roofs that shed snow like cloaks shrugged off in spring. A merchant named Yuri wants to send a message to his cousin Ivan, who lives near Pereyaslav, far to the south. The letter isn't long, just a few lines to say that the salt shipment was delayed by ice on Lake Ilmen, and that he hopes the family is warm and well. Yuri doesn't fold the note so much as roll it gently, like a dried leaf. The birch bark curls naturally, and he ties it with a thin strip of flax. He gives it to a tanner named Makar, who is traveling south with a group of traders. Makar accepts it wordlessly, slipping it between layers of sheepskin in his satchel. He may not deliver it himself. He probably won't, but someone will. And so the letter begins its descent through the principalities. First it travels by sled, pulled by two restless, steam-breathing horses, through snow so thick it muffles even the sound of hooves. The sled glides over the frozen Volkhov, past villages where dogs bark once and fall silent, and over miles of ice-laced stillness. At night, Makar sleeps near fires, wrapped in fur, with the letter still tucked beside his belongings, warm. Not from sentiment, but from the tight press of bodies and supplies packed for winter. A week later, near Torzhok, the tanners and traders split paths. One continues toward Smolensk, another toward Vladimir. Makar, now turning west, gives the letter to a man he knows, a monk named Timothy, walking toward the monastery of St. Michael near Chernigov. Timothy accepts it quietly, as monks often do. Letters were part of their lives too, not only scripture, but correspondence, prayer requests, and orders from bishops. The church, with its liturgies and landholdings, was one of the few institutions in Rus that needed writing to persist. The scriptoriums, such as they were, copied not only gospels, but occasional missives from noble patrons or requests for supplies. So Timothy adds the letter to his satchel, next to a folded wax tablet and a pouch of dried peas. He carries no horse, no sled, just boots, thick with soot, and the slow gait of a man used to distance. He walks through snow-covered pine, listening to the creak of ice in the trees. Days pass. Sometimes he stays in village churches. Other times he is given bread in exchange for a blessing. He travels through towns where the roads are churned to slush by oxen and carts, and where the smell of cooking cabbage drifts from crooked chimneys. The birch-bark letter remains unread, unbothered, cradled between the folds of his robe. In a settlement near Vishharod, Timothy leaves the message with a woodcutter's son named Pyotr, who is heading toward Pereyaslav with his uncles. Tools. It's not a formal relay. It's just what people did. Messages moved like shared stories, passed not because of duty, but because someone asked and someone else agreed. Pyotr, of course, cannot read the letter, but he knows the name on the outside. Ivan, it's a common name, but the village elders know the family. Ivan, son of Mikhail, who once traded wax in Kiev. He lives near the bend in the river, near the ruined stone granary. They point the way, so Pyotr delivers it, not ceremoniously, not with fanfare. He knocks on the wooden door, hands the curled bark to a bearded man in a wool cap, and then leaves without explanation. Ivan reads the letter by firelight. It's nothing dramatic, just a note about salt and snow and kinship. But it makes him smile, and then he turns it over and writes a few lines in return. The system is less a system than a web, loose and fragile, held together by habit and hope, and somehow it works. Some letters, though, never arrive. Others are intercepted, not by spies or enemies, but by life. A bag gets wet in the snow melt, and the ink fades. A trader forgets to pass it on. A monk dies on the road. A village floods and washes the letter out to sea. Not all communication is meant to endure, and yet messages continued to travel. There were times of unrest, of warring princes, of raids from the steppe, of internal rivalries and shifting borders. But even then, a boy might carry a note across the marsh from one hamlet to the next. A woman might whisper a message to a traveler headed south. The impulse to reach outward was never entirely extinguished. The 11th and 12th centuries brought slow change. More towns, more trade, more need for record-keeping. The princely courts, especially in Kiev and Vladimir, began keeping scribes more regularly. These scribes didn't just record treaties, They also copied letters and made sure deliveries were remembered. But even at the height of princely bureaucracy, there was no true postal service. No standard, just layers of human agreement, of shared paths and intersecting lives. The birch-bark letters, those humble scraps, tell us more than just what was said. They show us how deeply people wished to be heard. They show us what people valued enough to send, and how far a message could travel, even without maps, seals, or couriers. There's something ancient and familiar in that, in the quiet transfer of words from hand to hand, against a backdrop of snow and silence. But what do you write, knowing it may travel far or never arrive at all? Let's sit quietly with the image we left behind. A man in a thick woolen tunic, squinting at firelight as he reads a message scratched onto birch bark. Outside his wooden home, frost clings to the narrow fences, and somewhere off in the forest, a dog barks once and falls quiet again. The letter, short and ordinary, is held as though it were a loaf of bread, warm from the oven. What we're witnessing is not simply a personal message, but something larger, a rare point of contact in a world that often moved slowly, separately, and in silence. In Kievan Rus, there were no official couriers to speak of, no royal post bearing seals and stamps like those in Constantinople or Baghdad. There was only the will to connect, and the humble systems people shaped to do so. As the centuries went on, this will persisted. By the 12th century, Novgorod, the same city where our story began, had grown into a powerful republic, ruled not by princes alone, but by assemblies of merchants and landowners. It had laws, tax records, and an active class of literate townspeople, and from this expansion of civic life, the volume of communication increased. More writing, more reading, more letters, and more birch bark. It is difficult to overstate just how unusual Novgorod was. While literacy across medieval Europe remained largely confined to clergy and nobles, here even tradesmen and women seem to have known how to read and write at least a little. Archaeologists have uncovered hundreds of birch-bark letters, preserved by the damp soil, still legible after nearly 1,000 years. Some of them are legal disputes. Others are simple greetings. One letter, written by a boy named Onfim, includes a drawing of himself as a warrior on horseback, followed by the words, "Greetings from Onfim to Danilo." Others are sharper. A merchant scolds his agent for late payments. A woman writes to her brother about land rights. They are not epic. They are not poetic. They are, in their way, even better. Quiet slices of a life lived in snow, mud, and routine. And they all had to be carried, somehow, somewhere. Still, no one profession in Rus was tasked with this. Unlike the Qasida messengers of the Fatimid Caliphate or the trained imperial couriers of China, the letter carriers here were often just people, travelers, peasants, caravanners, monks, pilgrims in cities. A letter might be passed to an apprentice headed out to deliver goods. In rural villages, it might hitch a ride with a farmer taking dried fish to market. There were no uniforms, no posted rates, no guarantees, but the messages often arrived, not quickly, not reliably, but eventually, and in a time where there were few clocks. That was good enough. Of course, winters always tested the limits of communication. Snow could pile higher than a man's shoulders. Forest roads became little more than glistening corridors of ice. And when spring thaw came, it often made things worse. With rivers swelling, and entire stretches of road turned to slush and sink. Still, letters moved. Often it was the rivers that helped. In summer, canoes carved from single trunks floated downstream carrying fish, furs, and messages. On the Dnieper longboats used by traders ferried bundles wrapped in linen and birch-bark messages for relatives, receipts for goods, and reports for local lords. In time, the church helped regularize things, slightly. Monasteries became waypoints, places where messages could be stored or copied. Some monks kept logs of letters sent and received. Bishops occasionally appointed messengers to carry correspondence between dioceses. But still, this was a patchwork, one built from familiarity, obligation, and trust. There's an odd comfort in how low-tech it remained. Even when grand princes like Yaroslav or Vladimir Monomac tried to consolidate their rule. Even when charters were issued or treaties forged, the actual carrying of words still depended on someone tying a message into their belt and walking in a strange way. The fragility of this system may have added to the power of the written word. When a letter was this hard to send, when you knew the ink might run, the bark might crack, or the messenger might vanish in a snowstorm, it made what you said feel heavier. You wrote carefully, you waited patiently, you hoped, and even when words failed, people found other ways. Not all messages were written. Some were memorized, recited by a merchant at his cousin's doorstep, or whispered by a monk in a far-off chapel. Some were encoded in gifts, a piece of cloth meant to signal goodwill, or a carved token sent to say, "I remember." These informal codes existed alongside letters, neither replacing nor outshining them, but reinforcing a world where meaning was always in motion. Eventually, the Mongol invasion in the 13th century would shatter many of the fragile systems that held Kievan Rus together. Cities were burned, roads were broken, and the rhythms of daily life changed. But even then, even in the shadow of conquest, the urge to communicate survived. Letters were still written. Messages still crossed mountains and rivers and borders, centuries. Later, the Tsars would establish formal postal stations with horses, relays, and stamps. But in the early days, before bureaucracy, before statehood, there was only birch, bark, and belief. So perhaps, as you settle down into sleep, you might imagine the long line of hands that carried one letter to another, the soft crinkle of bark in a woolen pouch, the footprints vanishing behind a sled on a frozen trail. The dim firelight, as someone far from where it began opens a note and reads your name aloud. And in the quiet, snow-drifted world of early Rus, that might have been enough to reach across the miles, enough to be remembered, enough to be heard, even if it took all winter to arrive.